So for the second part of this call, I'm going to hand over to Nolwazi, who is going to introduce also our special guests for this afternoon and tell us a little bit more about the case study that we hope to be working on for the rest of this week, based on some of the inputs experts such as David and Mosip and Omidia and GSMA, who are also joining us on these afternoon calls for this week. So Nolwazi, over to you.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Before I get into our conversation today for our case study, I just wanted to remind everyone to please go take a look on campus. We've already put up some content, and I remember from our poll earlier today, we saw that most of the people here, well, at the time, haven't taken our digital identity course. So there's some interesting introductory videos on learning the language of ID and the definition, or what we call digital identity. And there's also the post that I want to bring particular attention to, which is on the group work activity that we've put up. So we put up there that we're inviting you to participate in a group activity on the case study, which is why we've given you a bit of background information to help you just better understand the context of eSwatini. And then we're asking you to participate in groups, or if you don't want to be in a group, you can be alone. And we've got a whole post there on all the information you'll need and the various awards for winning groups, because we ask you at the end of the week on Thursday, which is our last day of these calls, to give a 4-minute presentation on what you think or advice you would offer the regulators and policymakers in Eswatini on the eKYC project they're working on, and see what valuable input you can give. The winning team will be awarded a free seat in any of our DFI courses. And so we really are encouraging you to please participate. We've put up a template for you to use for your PowerPoint presentation, but you don't have to follow it. It's merely a guidance. You're not strictly enforced to follow it. And I've also I've included an optional reading list that might help you as you're thinking about how to formulate your answers in the link there, so that you can download that and think about how you can develop your PowerPoint as well. So if you have any questions regarding that group activity, please feel free to email. I didn't realize I was on mute this whole time and I've been talking.
Just the last part.
Just for a few seconds.
Oh, just for the few seconds. Okay, thanks. I've just put up Sarah and mine's email addresses if you have any questions regarding the group activity. So please feel free to contact us and we'll be happy to help. And so now I want to move on to the section of our case study and looking deeper into that. And I'd like to introduce to you Pili Ngumalo from the Central Bank of Eswatini. She's the General Manager of Finance and also the head of the FinTech unit of the Central Bank of Eswatini. She was there and established the FinTech unit in 2018 and worked towards publishing the regulatory sandbox guidelines and the first FinTech challenge or competition in Eswatini, as well as last year they ran the Eswatini Hackathon. So I'd want to, what we'll have now is more of a Q&A, or say a discussion between us. And I encourage you to think about any other questions you might want to ask her. Maybe one or two we'll be able to take with the time we have left. And then if you have any other questions, please feel free to log on to campus. If you don't know how, please email myself or Sarah and we'll help you with that. So you can see the content that's already there and also add any other questions you might have in the comments there, and then we'll see how best to help you with those answers. And also before I continue on the group activity, we've got office hours that we've put up, and we'll be having Sifiso Mashwama, also from the Central Bank of Eswatini, joining us in those office hours to answer any questions you might have on the case study. So those will be running tomorrow and Wednesday at 1 p.m. Cape Town time. So that's 11 UTC. So yeah, but we've put that information up on a post on campus. So let me continue. And before I continue, I just want to ask Pili to introduce herself as well. I think I've already said a bit, and she can say hi, and then we can get straight into our discussion.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to be here today. Lots of thanks to the DFI team, David, Sarah, and Nolwazi. We quite appreciate, sort of you zeroing in on Eswatini as a case study. we are, as mentioned already, sort of at the very early stages of considering what our digital identity roadmap might look like. And we look forward to the discussions this week and also hearing around the best ideas around how we might go about shaping our digital identity journey.
All right, thank you for your introduction, Pirire. And I've just got a few questions, and I'll start off with you looking just at the introduction so I understand that the Central Bank of Eswatini is currently working on an eKYC project. So eKYC is one of the use cases of digital identity. And I'd like to ask you if you can describe from your point of view how the Central Bank decided to start on this project and how you see the pathway rolling down or going along. And maybe you can touch on how existing databases in Eswatini will facilitate this process. So this includes VELA from the telecoms regulator, or KYC and CDD databases from the financial institutions, and of course the personal identification number, or PIN, from Home Affairs, and how that might work together in your eKYC project.
Okay, so thank you, Nolwazi. So just very briefly, the context of fintech in the Central Bank of Eswatini. So we did, sort of around 2018, start to realize that there was a lot of narrative, sort of in the market around fintech. And we wanted to take a closer look at it just to see what are the opportunities for development in our context, as well as to just generally understand sort of what might, how we might benefit from some of the developments that we see in that space. Very quickly, there are almost two key themes that quickly jumped out at us. And the first one was that fintech developments tended, at least in our context, to talk a lot to payment systems. And as far as payment systems are concerned, the central bank does have a mandate to promote safe and efficient payment systems. The second aspect, of course, is financial inclusion, the potential for fintech or developments in fintech to assist in driving financial inclusion up. So when we look at these two aspects together, you want to say, from a payment systems perspective, perhaps what are the current characteristics that make our systems to not be efficient, and try and see how you can apply sort of fintech developments to resolve those inefficiencies. The other aspect will then be to say, when you talk financial inclusion, what are the remaining barriers that you see that affect what the overall inclusion rate is? And again, that forms another point of conversion, because you start to look at eKYC and you start to realize actually there are points where the process is perhaps inefficient. And then from a financial inclusion perspective, you again pick up that eKYC can in some cases now start to act, or rather KYC can start to act as a barrier to inclusion, or even a barrier to meaningful interaction with financial services. So that really is the context of how we now zero in or sort of narrow down to say, why should an eKYC system or an eKYC implementation or project be important from a central bank perspective? And that's really the context that we come from. When we then look at our current situation, we do have various, I will call them perhaps functional IDs, where we talk about VELA with the communications regulator. We talk about KYC that sits with the commercial banks and some mobile money operators. You have the national ID system as well. But what is the reality is that each of these databases have a slice of the information that you need, not that entire end-to-end, perhaps full KYC that you might require, whether it's for basic access or even deeper or meaningful interaction with financial services. So when we look at all these different databases, we're then tempted to say, how could you get to a situation where you had one digital identity system that could satisfy the needs or the requirements for all the different stakeholders? Of course, from a central bank perspective, the key objective being to make the KYC process to be efficient, firstly, and secondly, to make sure that it does not act as a barrier to financial inclusion. So ultimately, when we talk then about what then is the central bank's interest or goal as far as a digital identity system would be, you want to sort of zero in on these two aspects, the efficiency aspect, and then secondly, removing what is currently somewhat a barrier to financial inclusion or even to deeper or more meaningful interaction with financial services. So it is really those two aspects, I think, that the central bank would point out as the key priority areas when we talk about digital identity and eKYC.
All right, thank you for that. That was a very thorough answer. And I think I want to touch on what you mentioned on barriers to financial inclusion. To ask you about proof of address, which we all know in most sub-Saharan African countries, most of the populations are rural, and then proof of address proves to be a significant stumbling block towards financial inclusion, or even access, not even usage or access to financial services. So how do you think eSwatini would tackle this barrier? Because we've seen in South Africa that Capitec Bank recently has accounts where they don't use proof of address anymore. And is eSwatini considering that for the financial system?
Okay, so eSwatini already uses or allows the use of a tiered KYC sort of approach. And what that does, it would say that for a basic entry-level type account with any of the financial services providers, you could be able to open and carry out sort of minimum type transactions with certain restrictions or limitations, just purely based on the national ID. But the challenge with this oftentimes is that as much as for that initial onboarding, this is usually appropriate. For a commercial bank, if there were other services that they wanted to sell to that customer in order to broaden the range of services available to that customer, they would then need to go that route of doing the full KYC and therefore require the proof of address. It's almost a similar situation as well with your mobile money providers, where that entry-level account at onboarding is probably fine, but in order to deepen the interaction with the financial services or products available, you then need to do that other bit of proof of address. So clearly what you need perhaps is, yes, the tiered KYC is a solution and it assists, sort of onboarding customers at that lower level. But probably the pain point that we need to also address is, yes, then if you have been onboarded and you need a proof of address in order to access a bigger range of services, what then can be done there? And I think those are the key considerations as we launch into a project of this nature, to say, these are maybe some of the things that we need to consider, that perhaps it's not just enough to say that we have the tiered KYC approach and an entry-level account can come in just based on an ID. How do we remove the pain points with the addressing system as well? These then are discussions that we have had with the responsible government ministry, which is Ministry ICT, and they have a number of ideas around how to address the addressing system shortfalls that currently exist. And it is for this reason that we think possibly a more collaborative approach is required, because perhaps there isn't any particular action from a central bank perspective that needs to be taken, but it's rather collaboration with the stakeholder that is actively working to close out that particular pay point. I think let me leave it there for now, Nolwazi. And I know that as the discussions continue, this is going to keep coming back at us again and again. And at this point, probably I should just underscore what I said earlier on, that, you know, for us to think that the tiered KYC approach is sufficient, it's only half the homework. The rest of it is also saying, so now, if you've been onboarded on that tiered KYC at that entry level with just your national ID, how do we get you to a point where you do that full KYC in order to access a wider range of services? So that, I think, is still some of the key considerations around eKYC that we are looking at.
Thank you, Pili. And I like that now that you're talking about the customer and ensuring that they've got access to services that they are fit for purpose or fit for use for them. And so I also want to touch on something else that touches on the customers, in the sense that, in your viewpoint, how do you think, as you're planning or working on this eKYC project, you'll ensure the privacy of the customers? Because there's always that debate on whether you want this convenience versus privacy, and how open or how willing to share the information are customers. And can you speak on that? I know that recently the data protection bill was tabled to Parliament. And I just want to hear from you what you think, or how you think the data protection and privacy will be ensured when you're rolling out this project.
Okay, so I think that David has touched on it very nicely. I think there are lots of lessons to be learned from the Kenya example. I think, yes, you know, you want to say, how can I quickly run with this? But the key lesson that we're all learning is it's also equally important to have the regulatory framework to be in place before you roll out initiatives such as this one. And you are correct that our data protection bill is currently in debate at this stage. Various consultations are ongoing, etc. When we look at the timelines associated with possibly getting it enacted as a law, and perhaps the stage at which this particular project is at, there is a reason to be, you know, sort of optimistic that the timelines will probably go hand in hand. And by the time you want to really go big into the market with a project such as this one, your regulatory landscape is in place. Of course, you know, when a bill is being debated, there are all sorts of differing views and perhaps different understandings as well as to what its purpose or use is. But as far as the consultations that we have taken on this particular bill, we believe that it will set a good framework or a good environment, enabling environment for a project such as what we have in mind with digital KYC.
Thank you. And on that, as we're talking about regulation, are there any regulatory changes that the central bank will need to make towards enabling digital KYC, maybe updating any issuing any directives or updating any regulations you have currently?
So there is a lot of work around getting our legislative framework to enable not just an eKYC or a digital identity project to come through, but other financial sort of fintech projects as well. If I could just mention a few of those, I think when we talk digital identity, it will be this data protection Act and the regulations that we now need to issue specifically into the financial services industry flowing from there. In my mind, that is probably the topmost and most crucial one. If I look at other regulations we want to look at, we've got things like cybersecurity standards, which are going to be key and very complementary to what we're trying to achieve here. And of course, in terms of the FinTech roadmap, we have all sorts of other complementary guidelines that work towards creating that enabling environment. But yes, top of my head, the most important one is going to be the data protection bill, and then the regulations or standards that we issue for the financial services industry flowing therefrom.
All right, I just want to ask you one last question before I hand off to Sarah, as I see our time is almost done. Can you describe any challenges or limitations you think you'll have while on your roadmap towards implementing eKYC in eSwatini?
Okay, so this is always great, and it's probably one of the things I'm looking forward to, this hearing ideas from around the globe on this particular aspect. I do think that the legislative framework is going to be a challenge. As much as we maybe think data protection were on the right track, you know, we don't know at this stage whether there will be any other frameworks that we need to consider. We do think that to a certain extent, the regulatory regime as well might be an issue, because you might have sort of certain things falling within the scope of one regulator versus another, and so on. So collaboration or MOUs around the regulators in the environment is going to be very key. And then something as well that David touched on earlier on, it's fostering collaboration as well from all the players, including the private sector players on this particular topic. I think that that's going to be a key challenge that we need to quickly address. I think I also want to just slip in, I know we've got limited time, but we do have further discussions later on in the week. But I do want to slip in another aspect. You know, with eSwatini being a small country, population about 1 million or so, sometimes it becomes difficult to roll out big capital projects from the perspective of cost recovery. You see, you know, sort of projects such as perhaps this one being rolled out at an exorbitant cost that now leads to a huge cost for the consumer if those costs are to be recovered. So one of the key considerations, I think, from a central bank perspective, and certainly with the other regulators that we are having this conversation with, is how do we make sure that projects such as this don't end up creating some sort of exclusion, in the sense that it might not be as easy to access from a cost perspective. So that is just one aspect that I wanted to quickly slip in, Nolwazi, before we close our conversation.
All right, thank you very much, Peter, for all your informative answers. I hope everyone was taking note of those. So we'll also post the videos from today's discussion on campus for you to reflect back with a bit of a summary. And now I'll hand over to Sarah, as I see our time is almost up. Thank you very much again, Peter, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Palile. Thank you, Nolwazi. And also thank you, David. We've had a very interesting hour. We've covered an awful lot in a short space of time. As Nolwazi says, we'll be posting the videos and some highlights as well in between today and tomorrow's calls, so you can catch up and look back on and reflect. Just a quick reminder about tomorrow's call. Again, same time, we'll different Zoom links. So please go back to campus to check the Zoom link to make sure you join the right one. We'll also send an email around to everybody as well, just to help prompt you with that Zoom link. And tomorrow's we'll be focusing on discussing about open source ID. So as David spoke about in his earlier presentation, but we also have speakers from MOSIP coming tomorrow, and a mid-year as well. So that will be the discussion there. And we'll also make sure we have an eSwatini slant on 1 or 2 of those questions so that we can see open source might be applicable in eSwatini. So all enjoyed today's call. Sorry we haven't had too much time for questions, but thankfully not too many came through. Come armed with your questions for tomorrow's discussion, and we look forward to seeing you all again in 23 hours. Everybody, bye-bye.